At the beginning of the 7th century, power in the Middle East belonged to two large states of the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire. These states were constantly at war for dominance in the region, but since the forces were approximately equal, none of them could win a decisive victory. For a long time, the Euphrates River was the border between empires. Since the struggle for the border territories practically did not stop, it was on them that the main fortifications and forces of the two empires were concentrated. Numerous Arab tribes lived on the southern borders of the two empires. Since neither Byzantium nor Sasanian Persia considered these tribes a serious threat, they did not keep large garrisons in the south. The vassal Arab states acted as protection against the raids of the Arab tribes. So the state of the Ghassanids protected the southern border of the Byzantine Empire, and the state of the Lakhmids ensured the protection of the southern borders of Sassanid Persia. The Ghassanids and Lakhmids also fought among themselves, but the empires did not interfere in this confrontation. This balance of power lasted for many years, but by the beginning of the 7th century it was broken. The fact is that the Lakhmid ruler Numan II converted to Christianity and tried to gain independence from the Sassanid Empire. In turn, the ruler of Sasanian Persia, Khosrow II, in 602, defeated the army of his recalcitrant vassal and included the Lakhmid state into his empire. Inspired by an easy victory over the Lakhmids, Khosrow II unleashed a war against the Byzantine Empire. At the initial stage, the Sassanids were lucky. They were able to inflict a number of defeats on the Byzantines and establish control over vast territories. But in the end, luck turned away from the Persians. By 622, the Byzantines managed to accumulate enough forces to launch a counteroffensive. Already by 628, they were able not only to regain control over the previously lost Syria and Palestine, but also to capture a significant part of the Sasanian province of Mesopotamia. The devastation caused by the war, which lasted more than 20 years, as well as the successful offensive of the Byzantine army, led to an increase in discontent among the population of the Sassanid Empire. In addition, against the backdrop of military failures, Khosrow II began repressions against senior civil and military officials. In the end, a conspiracy was organized as a result of which Khosrow II was killed. Immediately after this, a peace treaty was concluded with the Byzantine Empire, which returned the borders to the state at the beginning of the war, and a long struggle for power began in the Sassanid Empire, which ended only in 632 with the ascension to the throne of the 8-year-old grandson of Khosrow II, Yazdijerd III. While the two empires fought furiously with each other, on the Arabian Peninsula, the Prophet Muhammad managed to unite numerous Arab tribes under his rule. In 632, after the death of the Prophet, Abu Bakr became the ruler of the new state, who received the title of Rashidun Caliphate. Not all Arab tribes recognized the authority of Abu Bakr. In many parts of the Arabian Peninsula, uprisings broke out, the leaders of which declared themselves new prophets. It was the desire of the leaders of the rebels to become a new prophet that prevented them from uniting and jointly opposing Abu Bakr. In turn, the Rashidun Caliph did not waste time in vain and began to take action. He divided his army into several parts and ordered them to attack the rebels. Very soon, all pockets of resistance were crushed, and in the hands of Abu Bakr was power over the entire Arabian Peninsula. Having concentrated an impressive military force in his hands, Abu Bakr was well aware that a more suitable moment for expanding the territories under his control could not be found, since both empires were bled dry by a long war with each other and had not yet had time to restore their strength. The Caliph chose the Sassanid Empire as the main target for the attack, as it was weakened not only by the war against Byzantium, but also by the recently ended civil war, because of which it simply did not have the strength for serious resistance. Another important factor was that both the Byzantine and Persian populations were heavily taxed due to the long war, so the likelihood that they would defect to the Caliphate in exchange for a reduction in the tax burden was quite high. Abu Bakr entrusted Khalid ibn al-Walid to lead the attack on the Sassanid Empire, who managed to earn the fame of a talented commander. In March 633, Khalid al-Walid, at the head of an army of 10,000 soldiers, advanced towards the borders of the Sasanian Empire. Along the way he was joined by the leaders of the Arab tribes, due to which the size of his army increased to 18,000 people. Khalid was well aware that he would be opposed by the heavily armed infantry and cavalry of the Persians, which would be quite difficult to cope with in direct confrontation. To increase his own chances of victory, he decided to use military cunning and wear down the enemy before the battle. Before they invaded the territory of the Sassanid Empire, Khalid sent a letter to the Persian governor in the city of Uballa with an offer to convert to Islam or pay jizya. The Persians, of course, were not satisfied with both options, and they began preparations for the upcoming battle. Two roads led from the Arabian Peninsula to Uballa through the cities of Kazima and Hufir. The Persians decided that the Arabs would go to Uballa along the shortest route through Kazima and concentrated their troops near this city. Some time later, the Persian commander received news that the Arabs were approaching the city of Hufir. The Sassanid army hastily advanced towards Hufir. Having reached the outskirts of the city, the Persians did not find the army of the Caliphate there, but instead received news that the Arabs had advanced through the desert towards the city of Kazima. Without wasting time to rest, the Persians went to Kazima, where the rested Arab army was waiting for them. Khalid formed his army with his back to the desert, where he planned to retreat in case the battle went against him. After the weary Persian army arrived on the battlefield, its commander Hormuz made a serious mistake by challenging Khalid al-Walid to a duel. In a duel, Hormuz lost and was killed, which undermined the morale of the Persian army. After the Arabs launched an attack, the commanders of the flanks of the Persian army fled with their people from the battlefield, due to which the remaining Persian army was defeated. Despite the victory, Khalid was unable to take Uballa, since by this time the Persian army under the command of Karin's ibn Karyans had arrived in the city. This army was joined by the commanders of the left and right flanks of the army of Hormuz who fled from the battlefield. To justify their flight, they began to talk about the incredible power of the Arab army. Because of these stories, Ibn Karyans decided to fight the Arab army on the banks of the Euphrates River so that he would have the opportunity to escape if the Caliphate's army began to win. When Khalid, at the head of his army, arrived at the battle site, he saw a large number of ships behind the backs of the Persian army and realized that the enemy was afraid and prepared the retreat in advance. Khalid immediately ordered his army to launch an attack. The battle was short-lived, as the morale of the Persian army was extremely low. Almost immediately after the attack of the Arabs, the Persians faltered and began to flee. After the victory, Khalid occupied the city of Uballa without a fight and began to expand the territories under his control. Meanwhile, the ruler of Sasanian Persia, Yazdijerd III, began to gather two armies in the capital Ctesiphon in order to resist the Arab invasion. When the first army was assembled, it was led by Andarzaghar. The Persians were well aware that the Arabs would advance to the north of Mesopotamia along the Euphrates River, so as not to go far from the desert and not lose their main advantage. Therefore, Andarzaghar, at the head of his army, crossed the Euphrates River near the village of Al-Walaja and, taking up defensive positions, began to wait for the arrival of the Arab army. Very soon the army of the Caliphate reached the outskirts of Al-Walaja. Before the start of the battle, the parties had the following forces. The number of the Persian army was about 30,000 soldiers. In turn, Khalid al-Walid was able to win over the Arab population living in the conquered territories, thanks to which the size of his army reached 20,000 soldiers. Since the Persian army consisted mainly of infantry and therefore had low mobility, Andarzaghar decided to take up defense and go on the counteroffensive after the Arab attack bogged down. The Persians lined up on the plain, dividing their army into three parts. The rear of the center and the right flank of the Persian army was covered by a long ridge up to 10 meters high located in the west of the plain. The rear of the left flank of the Persian army was covered by a ridge located in the northeast of the plain behind which one of the branches of the Euphrates River flowed. The Persian cavalry must cover the flanks of the infantry from the attacks of the Arab horsemen. Khalid al-Walid also divided his infantry into three parts and lined up in front of the enemy. Assessing the position taken by the Persian army, Khalid realized that a frontal attack would not bring him victory, so he decided to use a military trick. Taking advantage of the fact that he had a lot of cavalry at his disposal, he ordered 4,000 horsemen to leave the camp the night before the battle and covertly take up positions behind the western ridge. After all the preparations were completed in the early morning, the Arab army launched an attack. As the Persians expected, the frontal attack of the Arabs did not bring any result, since their onslaught could not disrupt the formation of the Persian infantry. Hand-to-hand combat ensued, during which the Arab infantry began to back away. Everything went according to the plan of the Persian commander, so he ordered his entire army to launch a counterattack. He did not suspect that it was at this moment that he fell into the trap of Khalid al-Walid. The fact is that despite the onslaught of the Persian infantry, the Arabs did not flee, but retreated, maintaining battle formations and repelling enemy attacks. And Darzagar thought he had already won as the Arab army was retreating. At this moment, the Arab cavalry appeared from behind the western ridge, which swiftly attacked the rear of the Persian army. Under the onslaught of the Arab cavalry, the Persian horsemen faltered and hastily left the battlefield. At that moment, panic began in the ranks of the Persian army, as the Persians decided that a second Arab army had attacked their rear. The Persians stopped resisting and began to flee. In turn, the Arabs began to pursue the enemy, trying to inflict as much damage on him as possible. After some time, the remnants of the Persian army, which managed to leave the battlefield, began to gather near the city of Ulais, located about 20 miles from Al-Walaja. Also in the vicinity of Ulais, wars from the Arab tribes who converted to Christianity began to gather. The Persians planned to achieve an overwhelming numerical advantage and then attack the Arab army again. Their plans were not destined to come true. Very soon, Khalid al-Walid learned that the Persians were gathering a new army in the vicinity of the village of Ulais and began to take action. He decided to attack the Persians before they received reinforcements and completed the regrouping of their army. In order to secure an advantage over the numerically superior enemy, Khalid decided to attack the Persians at noon, when their army was taking food and not ready for battle. Covertly approaching the enemy camp, the Arabs launched an offensive attacking the enemy simultaneously from several directions. The Persians were taken by surprise, but their commanders tried to force their troops into battle formations to meet the enemy attack. Unfortunately for the command of the Sassanid army, the morale of the Persians was undermined by the recent defeat at Al-Walaja, so only a few detachments tried to resist. Most of the army left the battlefield and began to flee. Those detachments that nevertheless tried to resist fought fiercely, but by evening they were completely destroyed. Having defeated the enemy army, the Arabs managed to occupy the capital of Persian Mesopotamia, the city of Hira, and continued to expand the territories under their control. Already in July 633, the cities of Ain Tamr and Al-Anbar fell under the control of the Arab Caliphate. Meanwhile, the Persians did not lose hope of regaining control over the territories occupied by the Arabs. To solve this problem, they began to gather forces in Zumail, Sani and Muzaya. According to the plan, the assembled detachments were to unite and defeat the Arab army with joint efforts. The plans of the Persians were not destined to come true, since by this time Khalid had managed to send scouts to all parts of Mesopotamia. In this way, he quickly received information that the Persians were gathering fresh forces. Realizing full well that if the Persians succeeded in uniting all three armies they were gathering, they would have an overwhelming numerical advantage on their side, Khalid decided to act immediately. He divided his army into three parts and ordered to advance towards the Persian camp near Muzaya. During the night, all three Arab armies simultaneously attacked the Persian camp from three sides. The Persians were taken by surprise and did not have time to line up in battle formations, because of which they were quickly defeated. Oddly enough, Khalid managed to repeat this military stratagem 2 more times. As a result of a swift night attack, he managed to break the Persian camps near the cities of Sani and Zumail. Having won 3 decisive victories, Khalid got the opportunity to launch an attack on the capital of Sasanian Persia, the city of Ctesiphon, but he was in no hurry to launch a decisive attack. The fact is that Khalid wanted to secure the rear of his army and therefore decided to first destroy all the Persian troops in Mesopotamia. At this time, the Persians gathered all the forces remaining in Mesopotamia as well as the Christian allies of the Arabs, in the city of Firas, which was located on the border with the Byzantine Empire. Since Firas was a border town, in addition to the Persian one, it also housed the Byzantine garrison, which, having learned about the approach of the Arab army, agreed to help the Persians. The battle took place on the banks of the Euphrates River in January 634. The Persian troops and the Byzantine detachments allied to them were defeated, and the city of Firas came under the control of the Arab Caliphate. Having won the victory, Khalid began to make plans to attack the city of Qadisiyah, which protected the road to the Persian capital. Khalid did not succeed in bringing his plans to life, since at that time he received an order from Abu Bakr to hastily advance to Syria in order to lead an army in the fight against the Byzantine Empire. On this, the first stage of the confrontation between the Arab Caliphate and the Sassanid Empire ended. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell.